From strange coincidences to unpredictable domino effects, there are many instances in history where chance and luck seem to be more significant than normal. Sometimes these moments of chance can change the world, while other times it's just an eerie coincidence that leaves us wondering if fate is real. Number 10. In early 2015, a hospital in Florida hired nurse's aide Holly O'Brien. A few months later, the same hospital hired Megan Hughes to work on the same floor on the same shift. As far as anyone knew, the two women had never met before, but a strange series of coincidences had brought them both from the same home in South Korea to the same hospital in Florida. Holly was born in South Korea in 1969. Her mother passed away when she was young, and her father remarried and had a second daughter, Yoon-suk. But her father was an alcoholic, which eventually led to the breakup of his second marriage. Yoon-suk's mother took her and left when Poknam was just 2 years old. A few years later, Poknam's father passed away and Poknam went to live in an orphanage. At the age of 9, she was adopted by an American family and given a new name, Holly. She moved to Alexandria, Virginia, and started her new life. It was the warm and loving environment she'd been missing for years. But Holly was troubled by the memory of her sister, who'd only been an infant when she last saw her. The family contacted the orphanage to see if they had any information about Yoon-suk. Unfortunately, they had no knowledge of any biological relatives. It seemed like it was impossible that Holly would ever see her little sister again. Even from a young age, Holly liked looking after people. She'd help take care of the younger children at the orphanage. She decided that was what she wanted to do with her life, and in 1991, she earned her certified nursing assistant's license. She worked for a time at a nursing home and then a rehabilitation center in Florida. After several years of working there, she made the switch to Doctors Hospital in Sarasota. Around the same time, another nurse's aide named Matthew Nelms was hired. Nelms had previously worked at another hospital, where he made friends with a woman named Megan Hughes. Megan was also from Korea and had been adopted by an American family after her mother left her at an orphanage. She didn't remember much about her life in Korea and had been very young when she arrived in the US. She originally lived in Kingston, New York, but moved to Venice, Florida in 1981. Megan enjoyed working with people, which led her to a career in nursing. She wanted to work at Doctors, and Nelms pestered his boss about hiring her. Eventually, his boss relented and looked into Megan's application. She was a good fit and she was hired for the job. Not long after working at the hospital, a patient told Megan about another South Korean woman working at the hospital. Megan and Holly worked on the same floor, the same shift. They got to know one another and found out they had a lot in common. Even though Megan didn't remember much of her life in Korea, there were enough connections for Holly to begin to wonder about her long-lost sister. The two women completed a DNA test. Even though it seemed very unlikely, there were too many similarities for them to ignore. Both had come from roughly the same area of Korea, and they both had the same Korean surname. When the test results came back, it confirmed that the similarities weren't coincidental. Holly and Megan were half-sisters. It's hard to believe, but chance and coincidences had brought the two together decades after they were separated. Number 9. William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes were two writers that shaped modern Western literature. They lived very different lives, and one enjoyed much more success than the other, but they lived at the same time and both coincidentally have the same death dates. Shakespeare is a writer that most people in the English-speaking world have heard of. His plays have been translated into over 100 different languages and inspired many other works of literature. While his plays are well known, the life of Shakespeare himself is less well studied. Shakespeare was born to a well-off family in the small town of Stratford-upon-Avon, sometime in the spring of 1567. The exact date of his birth is a mystery, but we do know he was baptized on April 26th. Today, most biographers will list his date of birth as a few days earlier, on April 23rd. Not only is that St. George's Day, but it would also be the date that Shakespeare passed away, 52 years later. He studied at the local grammar school, but records of his life stop in his late teens. He reappeared again in London in his 20s, and from that point on, Shakespeare's career went from strength to strength. He was part of a playing company called Lord Chamberlain's Men, which later became the King's Men. He was successful throughout his career, with a consistent string of hit plays up until his retirement around 1613, when he moved back to his hometown. He passed away suddenly on April 23rd of 1616. In contrast, de Cervantes had a much more eventful life. It's also one that we know more about, even if he himself isn't as well known. He was born in 1547 to a noble family in Spain, but one that didn't have much money. He served in the Spanish Navy and was wounded in the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman Empire in 1571, and the wound left him without the use of his left hand. De Cervantes' problems with the Ottomans continued when he and his brother were captured by the Ottoman pirates in 1575. Their father gave all the money that he had, but it was only enough for the release of de Cervantes' brother. De Cervantes then spent 5 years doing hard labor for the government of Algiers, before a group of Trinitarians finally raised enough money for his release. After such an eventful period in his life, de Cervantes tried to settle down and start writing. He wrote a play about his time in Algiers, but it wasn't successful. He enlisted in the army again, where he worked as a purchasing agent, only to be imprisoned due to irregularities in his bookkeeping. He was released only to be imprisoned again a few years later, when it was suspected he was involved in a murder plot. Through this hardship, de Cervantes continued his writing, and it was when he was in prison that he would write the book he's remembered for today, Don Quixote. While Shakespeare is remembered for changing the English language, Don Quixote is recognized as the first modern novel. It's the second most translated book in the world and has been labeled as the best book of all time. The work is satire and pokes fun at the chivalric romances that were popular at the time. He later wrote a sequel to the famous work, which some have seen as a response to those who interpreted Don Quixote in a way that he disagreed with. De Cervantes wrote a few more novels before passing away in April of 1616. The date for his passing is listed as the 23rd of April, the same date given for Shakespeare. On the surface, it would seem that the two literary greats coincidentally passed away on the same day. But in Spain at the time, the date was normally the date that the individual was buried. De Cervantes likely passed away a day earlier. There was also the fact that England and Spain used different calendars. Spain had already adopted the Gregorian calendar by this point, but England was using the Julian calendar. That meant that even though Shakespeare's date was listed as April 23rd, he actually lived 11 days longer than de Cervantes, passing away on May 3rd, according to the Spanish calendar. Number 8. Most people on the planet are right-handed. In fact, only roughly 10% of people write with and use their left hand most often. In the past, it was considered the work of the devil. Today, left-handedness is accepted as natural, even though it's unusual. But when it comes to presidents of the United States, it's not that unusual at all. 7 US presidents have been left-handed. 6 of these were in office since the end of World War II. That's 42% of presidents since the end of the Second World War, and a little over 15% since the founding of the country. This strange coincidence has been discussed in the media many times over the years. It was especially interesting during the 2008 presidential elections, when both candidates were left-handed. The first president who was known to be left-handed was James Garfield. It wasn't until Harry Truman in 1945 that the US would get its next left-handed president. He was left-handed as a child, but wrote with his right hand as an adult. He still did most other activities with his left, though. Gerald Ford was next, followed by Ronald Reagan, who also wrote with his right hand. The next 2 presidents were both left-handed, as was Barack Obama. For some, it's simply a matter of chance. Only 46 people have ever served as president, which isn't a large sample group. In statistics, if a sample group is too small, it can throw off the study and make it seem like one group is more represented than it actually is in the general population. The fact so many presidents are left-handed is just a chance. Others believe that there's something more intrinsic about being left-handed that makes people more likely to be elected. It's not a conspiracy to put left-handed people in office, but more about the way their brain works. People use elements from all over their brain to communicate effectively, but there are certain parts of the brain that specialize in certain parts of communication. The left side of the brain controls the right hand, and is also where spoken language is a focus, while the right side of the brain controls the left hand and nonverbal aspects of speech. Studies have found that left-handed people more often use the right side of the brain when communicating. Some people have suggested this makes them more effective TV personalities. Left-handed people are typically better able to communicate with nonverbal cues. This would explain the abundance of left-handed presidents during the TV era. It may also explain why left-handedness hasn't been a predominant in recent years. With only 2 presidents to go off of, it's not possible to say whether the trend has been reversed in the so-called post-TV era. But communicating via social media, often in the form of writing, is a much more left-brain focused activity, which wouldn't favor left-handed people as much. Number 7. Throughout history, many of the most useful inventions and discoveries made by humankind were created or stumbled upon by accident. One of these accidental discoveries was Teflon. The discovery was made in 1938 by chemists working for the DuPont Company. Roy J. Plunkett was the scientist in charge of the experiments. He was trying to create a new refrigerant. The company he worked for had created Freon a few years earlier, and it was now replacing the more obviously dangerous ammonia and sulfur dioxide in refrigerators. But DuPont was looking to see if other chlorofluorocarbons could also do the job. Plunkett was experimenting with a gas called tetrafluoroethylene, a chemical with 2 carbon and 4 fluorine atoms. The gas was stored in pressurized canisters at dry ice temperatures, and during experiments would be mixed with chlorine to create a CFC. When Plunkett and his assistant started experimenting one day, they noticed something odd. There was no more gas coming out of the canister, but the weight of the canister showed that it wasn't empty. A small amount of white powder came out. When they cut the canister open, they found more of the white powder at the bottom of the cylinder. The gas had polymerized, meaning the atoms had combined chemically in a chain. The knowledge of polymerization at the time had suggested that this shouldn't have been possible, but with the high pressure and the iron inside the cylinder acting as a catalyst, it happened. The new substance was given the short name PTFE. It obviously couldn't have been used as a refrigerant, and the original experiment was a failure, but Plunkett believed that the substance had the potential to be useful elsewhere, and other scientists started to uncover its properties. The first use for PTFE was as part of the Manhattan Project. The substance was stable at extreme temperatures, both high and low, and was resistant to corrosion. This made it especially valuable for coating valves and seals at the uranium enrichment plant at Oak Ridge. But after the end of the project, a new use had to be found. PTFE was expensive and difficult to produce, and scientists would have to find a significant use or it would be abandoned. Those uses would soon be discovered. PTFE is today most known for its use in nonstick cookware. The substance actually made it into the Guinness Book of World Records as the slickiest substance, as it had such a low friction coefficient. The book said it was effectively like wet ice on wet ice. Number 6. Of all the people who have claimed to be able to predict the future, Nostradamus is by far the most famous. The 16th century astrologer and physician is said to have predicted everything from the start of World War II to the accident that claimed the life of the King of France. One of the predictions that many people believe came true concerned the Great Fire of London. Nostradamus made his predictions in his book, The Prophecies, which was made up of 942 four-line poems. The poems were written in various languages and are typically vague enough that they could be applied to a variety of circumstances, but that hasn't stopped people from claiming that various events were predicted in the book. The verse concerning the Great Fire of London is even more controversial than most. The stanza goes, quote, "The blood of the just will commit a fault at London. Burnt through lightning of 23s, the 6. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed." There are a few coincidences that could make the verse line up with the fire that would take place over a century after the poem was written. The Great Fire of London started on September 2nd, 1666. It was the end of a hot and dry summer, and London was going through a drought. The wooden houses with thatched roofs and animal sheds filled with straw were the perfect kindling for a fire. The fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The baker thought he'd put the fire out and went to bed. But within a few hours, the fire had spread to an inferno. It quickly spread from house to house, with very little to stop it as it traveled south to the River Thames. When the Lord Mayor of London was first informed of the fire, he believed it would be quickly put out, but this wasn't like any fire that the city had seen before. Before long, even King Charles II was involved in trying to put out the blaze. He ordered that the buildings in the path of the fire be torn down to try to create a fire break. That didn't work. The lines of buckets were also useless. After 3 days, the Navy was called in to clear larger areas and create a bigger fire break. This finally stopped the fire in its tracks, and volunteer groups managed to control the flames. Most of London had been destroyed by the fire. That included the ancient buildings like the Guildhall and St. Paul's Cathedral, along with over 13,000 houses. But very few people actually passed away. Historians believe about 6 people lost their lives in the blaze. Afterwards, though, disease was rampant and many more people passed away. There are a few things people point out as evidence that the Great Fire was what Nostradamus was talking about in the poem. Even though lightning wasn't involved in the blaze at all, the line 23's the 6 could mean 66, the year that the fire took place. London is mentioned by name, but some believe that the ancient lady also refers to the city. It could alternatively be one of the buildings that was destroyed in the fire. Even though very few people passed in the fire, some believe that the final line actually referred to the many rats that perished in the fire. The Great Fire of London has been blamed for ending the plague that gripped the city, as rats and the infected fleas that lived on them were destroyed in the fire. Any connections between the poem and the horrifying historical event can be explained by coincidence, but that won't stop believers. Number 5. In late May of 1977, Marvel comic fans were able to pick up the latest issue of Marvel Team Up, where New York native Spider-Man teamed up with the Wasp to take on the villain Equinox. Just a few weeks later, those fans living in New York experienced something strangely similar to one of the events in the comic. In the comic, Equinox rampages through New York City, while the superheroes rush to create a device that will put a stop to him. During the rampage, the villain causes a citywide blackout, which causes problems for the heroes. The impact on the rest of the city isn't much of a focus. If the events in the real world just a few weeks later are anything to go off of, it would have done more damage than the villain himself. It was the night of July 13th, 1977, when the lights in New York City went out. Just after 11:30 p.m. on the warm summer night, 4 lightning strikes hit electrical power lines and substations. The extra electricity tripped the circuit breakers and damaged equipment. Workers at the local power company tried to solve the problem, bringing in power from elsewhere and isolating areas where it was possible. But piece by piece, the system completely broke down. An hour after the first lightning strike, the biggest generator in the city shut down, and a citywide blackout commenced. New York City had undergone blackouts before. About a decade earlier, the entire northeast region of the United States had been hit by electrical problems. That blackout lasted 13 hours. It was disruptive, and hundreds of thousands of people were trapped on the subway. But it also temporarily stopped crime, and only a few cases of looting were reported across the entire city. The same could not be said in 1977. The blackout lasted longer and impacted only the New York region, but those weren't the only differences. New York had been dealing with a lot of economic problems at the time of the disaster. A disruption in the supply of foreign oil had hit the state hard, and it had run into a lot of financial problems. Programs were cut, including police services. Many of the city's poorest residents were hit the hardest. There had been a building pressure, and it was as if the blackout ignited the powder keg. According to reports, only a few minutes passed before looting began. In the richer areas of the city, residents didn't notice anything out of the ordinary and went to bed like it was any other night. But in places like Harlem, Brooklyn, and the South Bronx, there was chaos. Looting was a serious problem, but there was also an increase in the number of fires and double the number of hoax calls made to the fire department. Police officers were ordered to report to the nearest police station, which often wasn't anywhere near where most of the crime was taking place. Those who were serving in those areas were dealing with thousands of people and were often overwhelmed. Over 4,000 arrests were made, but most of the looters were never caught. The following morning, power still hadn't been restored, but most of the chaos had faded away. It wasn't until that evening, after 25 hours, that power was finally restored to the city. Number 4. Confederate Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was one of the most famous soldiers to fight on either side of the American Civil War. He was one of the most successful commanders and had led the way to many Federal defeats. In the end, it would be his own men who would bring his downfall. In a strange coincidence, almost exactly a year later, the same strange fate would meet one of Jackson's successors, Lieutenant General James Longstreet. It was in the aftermath of the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 2, 1863, that Jackson was wounded. Jackson's troops had helped to dislodge the Union forces with a flanking maneuver, helping Robert E. Lee to win the battle. But Jackson wanted to push further and took a small portion of his troops to scout ahead. He often used the element of surprise to win the battle and was looking for the next opportunity to do just that. Eventually, he had to turn back to camp and ride along the orange plank road back to the rest of the troops. Unfortunately for him, it was too dark for the rest of the troops to recognize their commander and fellow soldiers. They believed the group were enemies and opened fire. Jackson was struck by 3 bullets, twice in the left arm and once in the left hand. Others in the scouting party tried to rush Jackson to safety. In the chaos, he was dropped from a stretcher, but the troops managed to get him away. Jackson's left arm was amputated, a very dangerous procedure during the Civil War period. Roughly a quarter of the soldiers who lost limbs would ultimately pass away due to infections, but it was the only way to save the lives of many soldiers who'd suffered horrifying wounds. The doctors didn't want to take any chances with the Star General and kept him away from people with obvious infections. Even though the amputation seemed to be healing properly, Jackson contracted some kind of illness. The doctors believed it to be a kind of pneumonia, which wasn't helped by his fall from the stretcher. Modern historians are still debating what the exact illness was, and believe it might have been a problem with clots, which can sometimes happen with amputations, even today. Whatever the illness was, Jackson was unable to recover and passed away on May 10th. Almost exactly a year later, fighting was happening again on the Orange Plank Road. This time it was part of the Battle of the Wilderness. James Longstreet was another Confederate general. He wasn't as well known as Stonewall Jackson, but was a valuable part of Lee's army. During the Battle of the Wilderness, Longstreet's forces helped to prevent a defeat from the Confederate forces. But history repeated itself before he could push the advantage he had. On the morning of May 6, 1864, Longstreet was leading a troop through the woods approaching Orange Plank Road. The group came across a small forest fire and decided to split up to go around it. Longstreet took half the troops to the right of the fire, while the rest of the unit went around the left. The right half of the unit crossed the road and then continued on to the woods on the other side. The left half lost sight of the rest of the troops and decided to wait at the road. Longstreet realized he'd left half the unit behind, so turned around to rejoin them. When the left half of the unit saw soldiers emerging from the woods, they thought it was a Union troop and opened fire. Longstreet was struck in the neck, but miraculously he managed to survive. He was removed from the battlefield for a time, but returned to fighting before the end of the war. Number 3. Scurvy is a disturbing disease that claimed the lives of millions of sailors during the Age of Exploration. It also, through a series of coincidences, led to the creation of an organization that still haunts Sicily, mainly Italy, and the US for decades. It wasn't until the 1790s that the cause of scurvy was determined. For millions of sailors, fatigue and sore arms and legs were the first signs of a horrifying disease that would see old wounds reopen and capillaries disintegrate. Through a series of experiments, doctors were able to figure out that the disease was actually a dietary problem, rather than some kind of infection. Today, we know that it's vitamin C that's needed to keep scurvy at bay. In the past, it was only known that citrus fruits were effective treatments. There was a huge demand for fruits like oranges and limes, but especially lemons. Lemons are difficult crops to cultivate. They need year-round moderate weather conditions and an ample water supply. There were few places where enough lemons could be grown to feed the new need for this wonder food. Sicily was one of these places. Historians looking at this period in history have described Sicily's lemon farms at this point as being like the discovery of oil. It changed the economy on the island and was the perfect way for farmers to get incredibly wealthy. The problem was there was a lot of work that needed to be done to not only keep the lemon trees alive, but also keep out any thieves. Unfortunately for the lemon farmers, this huge period of growth coincided with a weak government in Sicily. The island had recently come under the control of the Bourbon monarchy, but they didn't have that much actual control. Lawlessness was a real problem across the kingdom of the two Sicilies, especially in the more rural areas like the island of Sicily itself. Farms couldn't rely on the government to protect them from thieves and other criminals, so they turned to other sources of protection. Recent studies have looked into the historical records gathered when Sicily was unified. Historians found that the areas with the largest crime rates coincided with the areas with the most lemon farms. None of Sicily's other exports had this correlation. The early mafia organizations got their start protecting lemon farmers, and from harassing those lemon farmers that didn't hire them for protection. The industry was perfect for the organization. It provided a good source of money, and one that was impossible to produce without a certain level of protection. The fact that the government, or more official organizations, couldn't provide that protection meant it was the perfect set of circumstances for the organization to grow. Historians are reluctant to put the blame for the mafia organizations solely on the lemon farms. The weak government and the legacy of feudalism in Sicily were also important factors. It's possible that a similar organization may have come about even without this valuable export, but it definitely provided the perfect start for the mafia, which may not have seen quite as much success without scurvy and its important cure. Number 2. If his story is to be believed, Yang Kyung-jong may have had one of the most eventful experiences of any soldier during World War II. During the storming of Normandy, many prisoners of war were taken by the Allied forces. Among those were at least 4 individuals who appeared to be Japanese, but were wearing German uniforms. According to his story, Yang Kyung-jong was one of them. Yang was actually Korean, but through a series of coincidences he'd ended up in France, fighting on behalf of the Germans. He was captured for what would be the 3rd time in his life. Yang's story starts half a world away in Korea. Not much is known about his early life, but at the age of 18, he was conscripted into the Japanese army. Japan controlled Korea at the time, and would often use men from the country to fight its battles as it grew its empire. When World War II began, he was sent to Manchuria and northeast China to fight against the Russian forces. Most of the fighting of this time was border skirmishes, which had been happening before the war even broke out. One of these was the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, which lasted a little over 4 months. By the end of the fighting, 600 soldiers fighting on the Japanese side were taken as prisoners of war, and Yang was among them. Yang was sent to a labor camp where he stayed for a few years while the war raged on outside. The Soviet forces were taking heavy casualties, and those in charge looked for new men wherever they could. Prisoners of war were conscripted to fight on the side of the people that they'd once been fighting against. In 1942, Yang was conscripted. The following year, he was sent to Ukraine to fight in Kharkov. German forces had taken over the city in 1941. There had been an attempt to reclaim the city the following year, but the Soviet forces were pushed back again. The second attempt to reclaim the city wouldn't go any better. Tens of thousands of men lost their lives. Yang was lucky to survive the conflict, but he was one of many to be taken as a prisoner by the German forces. History would then repeat itself. After a string of successes, the German army was now beginning to run out of men. Soviet prisoners were conscripted into the eastern battalions and sent to fight all over Europe. Yang was sent to France and was in Normandy when the Allied forces arrived. Yang was serving somewhere near Utah Beach, where American troops would land during the invasion. He surrendered to U.S. paratroopers who believed he was a Japanese soldier fighting in a German uniform. He was handed over to the British forces and taken to England to be held in a prisoner of war camp there. Luckily for Yang, the Allied forces had no intention of using him to fight in the remainder of the war. He was sent to America, where he remained in another camp until the fighting had ended. Number 1. After any disaster, there are stories of people who narrowly missed being in the path of danger due to a few chance circumstances and coincidences. Most of those people go on to live ordinary lives after the near miss. Others produce artwork or launch companies that never would have existed if it hadn't been for those small coincidences. One of the most impactful companies that existed only due to chance was Standard Oil. It was December 17, 1867, and John D. Rockefeller was traveling to New York City for business. He was living in Cleveland at the time with his wife and their 1-year-old daughter. He planned to meet his brother to discuss business in New York, but also hoped to see some family and acquaintances for the holidays. He packed accordingly, with various gifts making their way into his luggage for the journey. Rockefeller was a very punctual man and had planned his trip so he could make the most of his time in New York. He would take the Lakeshore Express, leaving Cleveland's Union Station at 6:40 a.m., arriving in Buffalo at 1:30 p.m. The train to New York City left at 6 p.m., giving him plenty of time if the express was delayed for whatever reason. He'd then arrive in New York at 7 a.m. on December 19th, ready for meetings and visits with friends. But the problems began on his way to Union Station. He'd sent his luggage ahead but decided to spend a few more minutes with his family. By the time he left, traffic and other problems meant he didn't have enough time to make it to the train station. The express pulled out of Union Station just as Rockefeller arrived, leaving him behind. It was a frustrating start to the business trip, and Rockefeller set about making alternative arrangements to get to New York. In the meantime, the express train continued on. It made a few stops along the way, collecting more passengers, and by the time it reached its last passenger stop in Dunkirk, it was running over 2.5 hours behind schedule. The train was very busy, with about 50 passengers each in the final 2 carriages. Among the people who actually made it on the train were Stephen Stewart, the president of Oil Creek Railroad, Charles Lobdell, editor of the newspaper, and attorney Eliakim Forbush. There were also many ordinary people traveling to meet up with family and enjoy the holidays. At just after 3 p.m., the train's rear carriage ran over a connection point between 2 tracks. The carriage had a damaged axle, and the wheels slipped from the tracks. The carriage derailed just as the train reached Big Sister Creek Bridge, just outside of Angola. It decoupled from the rest of the train, but not before upsetting the next carriage along. Both carriages fell off the bridge as the train came to a halt. The rear carriage burst into flames. The train was lit by kerosene lamps, which had broken during the incident. Each carriage had coal-heated stoves to warm them. Unfortunately, the coals lit the kerosene and the entire carriage burned. Only 3 people in the carriage survived. Thankfully, the next carriage along didn't suffer too much damage. Everyone in the carriage was injured, but only 1 person passed away. A few hours later, Rockefeller's train passed the aftermath of the disaster, which was known as the Angola Horror. He telegraphed his wife to say that he was okay and that he hadn't been on the crashed train. The disaster led to stricter regulations on the railroads, including standards for track gauges and more effective braking systems. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.